Today we'll be talking about topicality. So here's our lovely resolution on the board. I know all of you have seen this before. But before we get into just like the parts of the resolution that are important for topicality reasons, and just like talking more about how to debate topicality, we'll be talking about just like why topicality is important, and beginning to think about just like why we need this as an argument in the negative toolbox. So topicality is an example of an off-case argument. You're aware of the other just like 3 off-case arguments that you've been introduced, types of off-case arguments that we've been introduced up until this point. And topicality is an argument that suggests that the affirmative team should lose for reading an affirmative that is outside of the boundaries of the resolution. So topicality, or T, as you will see it, referred to in debate parlance. So topicality, or T, is an event that suggests the affirmative should lose for falling outside the boundaries of the. Okay, so why do we need topicality? So there are 2 major reasons that I would say topicality is important. So all of you have already been exposed to some of these reasons just like by virtue of just having debates at this scale. So all of you are prepared to debate the UBI affirmative. You've debated it a ton of times before. You know that like the good reasons that the affirmative has for suggesting that we should do a UBI. You're familiar with a lot of the common negative objections to such a policy. So you know that you can have a quality debate about whether or not UBI is good or bad. So imagine if an affirmative were to read something that you're less prepared for, so like a federal jobs guarantee. That's something that also falls under the boundary of this resolution, as you can see here. But I imagine that if all of you were told to just like debate, right now, just like debate about a federal jobs guarantee, you'd feel a little bit less good about the prospects of that debate. You would have some things to say, like maybe your state's counterplan and your federalism disadvantage would apply, but you'd be a little bit less familiar about like the case arguments that you'd want to say against it. And then what if an AF were just like something entirely different? So like what if instead of just like fiscal redistribution, which is this topic mechanism, it was something like cutting Social Security and transferring wealth upward? That would be pretty bad. A lot of your arguments and your offensive arguments that are premised on fiscal redistribution being good would no longer apply. A lot of your case arguments would likewise not be as applicable because you have defense to fiscal redistribution and inequality and things like that, rather than another affirmative. So based on that, you can see that the predictability of affirmative cases plays an important role in your ability to debate it. So we can outline from that 2 reasons why topicality is important. So the first one is predictability. And predictability is a debate way of saying that you debate best when you know when you can expect what your opponent will say. So when you practice something, you've practiced it before, you're in a better position to debate it. Okay. And then the second reason that we care about topicality is education. So the topic changes every year for a reason, and we have determined that economic inequality is something that's worth talking about. So we've also determined that economic inequality is an area, a controversy of debate that has equitable grounds for both teams. So we'll get into what that means more a little bit later, but everybody agrees that there are some good reasons to redistribute wealth in the United States, and that there are some potential drawbacks to it. And those things should be debated. If an affirmative were to avoid that controversy entirely by debating something entirely different, then the debate wouldn't be as educational, and it would also be more difficult for the negative to win. So our 2 reasons that we care about topicality are predictability and education. Okay, so second, what should topicality shells look like? So we'll go over this in a bit when we talk about the shell that you will be debating. But a topicality shell is just a debate term a terminology that we use to delineate that that topicality in the 1NC needs to follow a particular structure and have particular components to it. So, this section. So what should topicality shells look like? There are a couple of parts to it. The first part that you will see in every topicality shell is an interpretation. So, interpretation, we'll make it A rather. So an interpretation is your explanation or definition of what a word in the resolution means. And 95% of the time, you will be reading a card that defines a word in the resolution. So a card that defines the word in the resolution. So, if we were to make a T violation that is based on what a basic income is, we would define the phrase basic income in the literature. It could be a dictionary definition that just is like a simple definition of what the word means. It could also be something more precise, like maybe from some sort of topic literature that is explaining how a basic income relates to inequality. So the first thing that we would do is define a word in the resolution using evidence, and then explain what that word means. And yeah. So it can be a dictionary definition, a contextual one. You can define one word, you can define several words in the resolution. And you may include a combination of different definitions and other just like logical arguments about what the resolution should look like. So the first part of the topicality shell is the interpretation. The second part is what we call the violation. So the violation is the reason the app's plan falls outside of your interpretation of the resolution. Okay, so these two first parts of a topicality shell are relatively straightforward. The negative team will define what the resolution means, what certain phrases in the resolution means based on evidence. And then if it's not incredibly obvious, they'll read more evidence that explains why the affirmative falls outside of that interpretation of the resolution. So the first two, just like parts of the topicality shell, will usually fixate on just like, sort of precise definitions of what specific words mean that clearly delineate that the affirmative falls outside of how the negative is defined in the resolution. Then the third part is where most of the debate occurs, and these are called standards or reasons to prefer. So we have an interpretation of the resolution. We've said that the affirmative falls outside of it, and now we're going to come up with some reasons that this interpretation of the resolution is better. So standards or reasons to prefer are reasons to prefer one interpretation of the resolution over the other. And this is where you'll answer the question. What does a good educational debate on this topic look like? Why is this a useful way of thinking about the resolution and of dividing ground in this debate? And why does this interpretation of the resolution provide a fair chance for both teams to be able to win the debate? So what does a good educational debate on this topic look like? And why is this interpretation a good way to divide ground between teams? Okay. So you'll use the standard section of the topicality shell, or your topicality violation, to explain why your interpretation of the resolution provides a good basis for debate, educational and predictable debates, and the affirmative's interpretation of the resolution, which includes their plan, would not. So the two most important standards that you will see mentioned are predictability, so similar to what we talked about above, and let's say limits. So predictability is premised on the belief that you debate better when you're prepared for what the other team is going to say. So you debate better when you are prepared for what the team is going to say. So if you have an interpretation that is predictable, let's say it's from a dictionary definition, that's a very predictable basis for somebody to define a word in resolution. You might have some disagreements over the technical meaning of just like, fiscal redistribution. But the definition of fiscal redistribution that comes from a dictionary that is like maybe defining the phrase redistribution is a pretty predictable standard for affirmative teams to have to follow and negative teams to have to respond to. So predictability, you debate better when you are more prepared for what the affirmative is going to say. So that leads to better clash, so both teams are responding to what other teams are saying, and just more education in general. So limits is the idea that in general, fewer topical cases reduces the research burden on the negative, which allows for a greater depth of negative research and better debates. So you can see that these two ideas are kind of tied to one another, which is why you'll often hear just like predictability and limits summed up in just one phrase that you could call predictable limits. But in general, limits holds that fewer topical cases results in better debates and allows the negative to be more prepared. So you understand this like just based on like the debates that we've been having at this camp. The debates have been pretty good for the stage that we all are at in thinking about the topic. And that's because we've all debated the UBI affirmative so many times. There's one affirmative that you need to respond, ready to respond to, and two advantages that you need to respond to at most. Which means that you automatically just know what you want to say against the UBI affirmative in a given debate. So that's why camps like use evidence packets. That's why the AUDL uses an evidence packet that just like limits the potential things that affirmatives can say. So when there's truly no limit on what affirmatives can say, outside of the resolution, it becomes pretty difficult. So limits argues that a more precisely and limited vision of the resolution is better for education and results in better debates. And then another important standard that you will often see mentioned, that I've already mentioned a couple of times in this lecture, is ground. So the resolution exists to divide ground, and there are some things that the affirmative can argue, and some things that the negative can argue. If the plan that, well, we'll say, if the absent interpretation of the resolution prevents the negative from making those core arguments, they should lose. Okay. So what's an example, somebody tell me, what's an example of a core negative argument that you would want to be able to read against any affirmative on this topic?
The state's counterplan.
Yeah, so the state's counterplan is a great example of something that you would want to say is core negative grounds on this topic. And there are different ways that just like, maybe the affirmative could just like define the resolution to avoid debating the state's counterplan. Maybe it's kind of tough because the phrase United States federal government is in this resolution. But maybe there are some ways that they could trickily define the resolution to avoid having to debate the state's counterplan. So yeah, a good example of an argument that is ground is the state's counterplan. So let's say state's counterplan. What's an example of another argument that is ground on this topic? Yeah. Yeah, the cap Act, a great example. So the resolution has a mechanism that is fiscal redistribution, and it says that it should be the United States federal government doing that, and it prescribes certain means for doing that. So based on that, we have decided that almost every affirmative should have a link to the capitalism K, which means that the negative should, at a minimum, be able to argue the capitalism K against an affirmative that they might not be totally familiar with because of the way that the resolution is written. So capitalism K. Yeah, and we can go on. It's really just the other arguments that you have, just like in this packet. So we have, federalism DA, politics DA, maybe the spending DA is something that you might see during the year that is otherwise just poor negative ground on this topic. Okay, so to sum it up, the standards or reasons to prefer are where you are painting a picture of what your vision of the topic looks like and why it results in more competitive debates. And you want to put them usually in these three terms. So predictability, our interpretation of the resolution is more predictable than the affirmatives, which means that they should lose the debate. Limits, our interpretation of the resolution allows for fewer cases and better in-depth research than the other one. And then ground. These are the core arguments that we need to be able to say against every affirmative. And ensuring that we are able to say them results in educational debates and also gives the negative a fair chance to win the debate. There's some other standards that I might get into a little bit later, just so you all are familiar with them. But for now, I guess let's move on to the last part of the topicality shell. And this is voters. So voters is the reason that your interpretation is significant enough to warrant a negative ballot. So the reason that your interpretation, let me scroll all the way here, is significant enough to warrant a negative ballot. So you are not just saying that the affirmative team has run afoul of the definition, and that is bad. But when you're arguing topicality, you have to go to the next level. And you have to argue that it is bad enough that they have run afoul of the resolution that they should lose the debate. And you'll remember that in Nick's negative strategy lecture last week, when you're going for topicality, the entire 2&R, so 5 minutes of the 2&R should be devoted to proving that the negative team should lose for running afoul of the resolution. So topicality is dependent on you winning so that certain voters are true. So what are the voters that you will see cited? They're the things that I mentioned earlier. So the reasons that topicality are important. So education and fairness. So the affirmative team should lose for undermining education and fairness in this debate. So if the affirmative does something that hurts the negative's ability to win the debate, so they steal the ground of core negative arguments that the negative wants to reach, then that is abusive and should justify voting negative. So you'll often hear this term phrased in terms of abuse. The idea that the affirmative did something anti-educational or anti-fairness that merits them losing the debate. Yeah, and education is also important here. So if debates are supposed to be educational, and the negative proves that the affirmative team is hurting education by the way that they're defining the resolution, then they should lose the debate. Okay, so we're going to shift gears looking at the specific topicality violation that you all will be debating over the course of this camp. But for now, does anybody have any questions about things that I've mentioned up until this point? Yeah, Joseph.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch it. Can you please remind me one more time what exactly is a topicality shell?
Yeah, so a topicality shell is the structure that a 1NC on topicality follows. So in the 1NC, you need to make a topicality shell, which is just like a phrase for the structure in the 1NC, that has these 4 components to it. So you need an interpretation that defines the resolution, a violation that explains how the affirmative falls outside of that definition of the resolution, and then you need standards or reasons to prefer your interpretation, which are all of these things that we went over, and then voters. So reasons that the affirmative falling outside of your interpretation of the resolution is harmful enough that they should lose the debate. So a shell is just the structure of those 4 subcomponents in the 1NC.
Good.
Other questions about topicality stuff at this point? So let's talk about this topicality violation. So this interpretation, or this shell rather, is structured very nicely, so we can see all the different just like parts of it clearly on display. So the first part of this shell is the interpretation, right? We have a definition using evidence that defines a certain phrase in the resolution. So which phrase in the resolution is this interpretation contesting or calling attention to? Yeah, Richie. Yeah, and where does that appear in the resolution? Where does that appear in the resolution?
It appears in the resolution where it says the United States federal government should substantially increase fiscal redistribution.
Right. So, you know, it's every affirmative is going to have to just like weigh in on this part of the resolution that says fiscal redistribution. So, you know, they could be a federal jobs guarantee, they could expand Social Security or provide basic income. We agree about that, but even if they do that, they still need to follow this part of the resolution, which is increasing fiscal redistribution. So we have a definition of redistribution as requiring the transfer of wealth from high to low incomes. And we have a piece of evidence that defines what that looks like. So redistribution is defined as the shift of income which occurs in the post-tax distribution from low to high incomes. And then we have some lovely math down here that you will not need to follow in order to argue this. What they arguing there, like that is, that's really something. A lot of letters there, no numbers. Thanks. Okay, so we have this definition of the resolution. Redistribution requires the transfer of wealth from high to low incomes. And it's just a really simple, straightforward definition of just like what that entails. So that means that after the plan happens, there has to be more wealth that exists in low income hands rather than high income hands. And taxes can be a means to do that, as well as the other three programs that are under the boundaries of this resolution. So we have our interpretation, then our second part is the violation. So this is a card that defines what the affirmative itself does. So in this case, the affirmative is UBI. And it is a definition of what UBI involves that argues that the plan itself would not be topical and fall outside of the boundaries of the previous definition of fiscal redistribution. So, you know, UBI, switching from targeted transfers to UBI results in a redistribution of income from low-income households to high-income ones. So this is a piece of evidence that is looking at previous examples of UBI and has determined that rather than resulting in distribution from high incomes to low incomes, the reverse is actually happening. So people pay taxes, they don't get as much back in the UBI, and that results in a transfer from low-income households to high-income households. So you can begin to see why this might cause some problems in the resolution. Yeah?
Even if UBI isn't means tested, it's still under the AF plan a progressive tax system. Doesn't that kind of just take out this whole argument if you're progressive tax system?
That would be a great affirmative response to this. Is that
I don't see
you know,
this being a very good term.
I think the reason that I think this could be compelling is because I think that many affirmative teams will not come out and say that that they use a progressive tax system in order to implement the plan. For instance, the affirmative in the packet says that they use a proportional tax system, not a progressive tax system. So there are certain ways that I think that affirmatives might actually be forced to, might actually result in a transfer of wealth from low to high income households based on the tax system that they use in order to avoid negative grounds. But we'll get into that in a second. So we have this violation that is defining what the plan itself looks like in comparison to the resolution. And then we have two nice reasons to refer here. So these are things that we talked about earlier. So the third part of our shell, standards or reasons to refer. We have limits, which argues that any plan that's economically beneficial in general rather than redistributive would fall under the boundaries of the resolution, which would make it difficult for the negative to compare. And then we have grounds, which argues that negative grounds, the things that the negative can say against the affirmative, is based on the ability to access grounds based off of fiscal redistribution. And then we have a lovely little voter section here, which says that standards are key to fairness and education. So, definition of the resolution, explanation of how the plan falls outside of that using evidence, and then some analytical reasons that you should prefer the negative interpretation of the resolution over the other one. Make sense? Yeah, so a couple of just like tips for just like debating T on the negative. So what's actually going to do? So two, how to win topicality on the negative. So what I've been trying to emphasize to this point in the lecture is that to win topicality debates, you want to think of this not just as a question of defining different definitions. Like, here's the definition of the resolution, they fall outside of this, we should lose. Sometimes that level of the debate is very important, but most of the time, topicality debates unfold based on an in-depth comparison of each team's standards or reasons to prefer. So you want to think about topicality as, hey guys, thanks. You want to think of topicality as not just a question of violating different definitions, but rather different models of debate and different visions of the topic. So think about topicality in terms of different models of debate and different visions of the topic. So when you're debating topicality, you want to forward a vision of the topic and explain what the debates would look like under that vision, and when that is superior to the imperatives definition. So this requires you to illustrate for the judge how the debate would be worse if you allow the app's interpretation of the resolution. So negative teams will always argue that a more limited topic with a more predictable set of affirmatives is better. And affirmative teams, on the flip side, will always argue that a larger topic with a wider set of affirmatives is more important and better for education. So your two tasks are to one, prove that the affirmative is not topical, which is taken care of by the interpretation and violation sections of the debate. And two, prove that this means that the app should lose. So your goal is almost always to prove that a more as negative is almost always to prove that a more limited version of the topic is better. And you need to give a reason that that is true. So limits allow, so some just general reason why limits are beneficial. So limits allow for more in-depth debates, which allows teams to craft specific responses rather than just generics. So our debates on the UBI affirmative have been beneficial because we've had specific responses to the negative mechanism of fiscal redistribution, and specifically have been able to contest that this particular UBI either does not do fiscal redistribution or does not do it successfully. And that allows for specific responses rather than just generics, like maybe the state's kind of plan in the politics CA, which you could say against almost everything. We have specific reasons that UBI is bad, and that's because we knew that UBI would be included on this topic, and in fact the ability to prepare for it. So it forces better research skills, and it forces affirmatives to be tested more rigorously. So there's a smaller topic, it allows for more rigorous testing of the affirmative, and just in general, better debates. And I will say that when you're negative, limits is a pretty convincing thing, and that you were able to, pretty easy thing to convince judges on. Most judges have been exposed to really unlimited topics in the past. Most educators know the importance of these things. So if you talk about a more limited and predictable version of the topic, most of the time you will fare pretty well in the negative, in topicality debates. Yeah. And then the second thing that you need to do in order to win topicality is to define the frame that the judge should use for interpreting topicality debates. So this is something that you'll sometimes see in the voters section, but I'll just talk about here. And that is, you need to win that competing interpretations is how judges should evaluate topicality. So competing interpretations. So competing interpretations is the idea that topicality debates should be decided based on whoever just has the better definition for debate. So topicality debate should be decided based on whoever has the better definition. So we'll get into this a little bit more later when we talk about reasonability, which is the affirmative alternative to competing interpretation. But the idea of competing interpretations basically argues that anything that they're winning on the standards debate, so if the negative is winning just like one example of limits of the way that their vision for the resolution is more limited, or one example of why their vision of the resolution is more predictable, then they should win the debate. So any negative advantage on the standards debate becomes instant negative offense. So like any other argument in debate, the negative needs to win some offense that is true in order for them to win. And the standards become offense when you are evaluating topicality through competing interpretations. So it just becomes clearly, or just like purely a question of whose interpretation of the resolution is better. And I think competing interpretations is generally thought of as a pretty good way to evaluate topicality, especially for the negative team, because it is not arbitrary, and it's very easy to determine which definition is better. So competing interpretations is a good standard to use because it is precise and allows for a clear delineation of who is winning the debate, whose vision is better. It's all said. So, so competing interpretations allows the negative to be just very clear about the standards level of debate. It makes it easy for the judge to determine who is winning. So our two tips for winning topicality in the negative are to emphasize limits and predictability and to emphasize competing interpretations as a framework for evaluating topicality. This leads into my third tip, which is that you should be very specific. So be specific. Illustrate to the judge what arguments are allowed under each side's vision of the resolution. And the way that you do that is usually through the idea of a case list, right? So there are a couple of things that you want to emphasize. And I actually think that there are maybe just like 3 lists that you should be thinking about when framing this. So 3 lists that are useful for illustrating this. So by lists, I mean specific examples of arguments that teams have actually read in debates or could conceivably read under each interpretation of the resolution. So the first one is, robust affirmatives allowed under your interpretation. So this is what we call a case list. And if you go to our specific topicality violation, we'll see that a case list is included. So any basic income program, as long as eligibility is somehow connected to lower incomes. So this is like from the topic lecture, what we talked about as means testing. Our interpretation of the resolution is that as long as the basic income is focused on lower income people, that it is allowed under our interpretation of the resolution. So you want to talk about what debates would look like under this interpretation of the resolution. So to give an example based on our specific violation, our interpretation allows for robust debates based on means tested basic income affirmatives targeted towards lower income people. So what are some examples of what that might look like? You could have certain income requirements that says that any family making less than maybe like $30,000 per year would have a basic income applied to them. You could give a basic income for certain classes or categories of workers or people in society. So maybe just like a basic income for people who are elderly or people who otherwise need extra assistance from the government. So any sort of basic income that just like gives money to lower income people would be included under this interpretation of resolution. And you would want to create a list. So like let's talk about benefits. So targeting eligibility for households receiving a relatively high share of transfers, mean transferred benefits where it's based on income, and then general minimum income basis needs on total household incomes or assets. So there's a lot of different affirmatives that could potentially fall under this vision resolution. And you would want to list these out. So basic income granted to people with low wealth based on income levels or other ways of measuring that. So that's the first list that you would want to include. And then the second one is egregious acts that the affirmative would justify, that their vision of the resolution would justify. And you want to use these to illustrate offense of your vision of the resolution. So second, egregious affirmatives that the alternative vision of the resolution would justify. And this is a place where you really want to be using examples to make your argument. So, I don't know, what are some examples of just like basic income basic income programs that would not be redistributive and therefore fall outside of the boundary of the resolution? So I don't know, one example that I came up with is, what if an affirmative were to stand up and say that doctors are important people in our society and we need to encourage more people to become doctors. So we should give a basic income to every doctor. That would technically be a basic income, right? Because it would be just like $10,000 a year to just like people who are in the medical profession. It would fall under the basic income part of the resolution. But if we didn't have this fiscal redistribution part of the resolution, then an affirmative like that would be allowed. So like, what are some other just like categories or just like examples of just like groups that you could give basic income to, absent this redistribution part of the resolution? Yeah. Seniors, yeah. Like you could just read an affirmative that's like, what did you say? Seniors. Oh, sorry. You could read an affirmative that is just, well, Social Security would kind of fall under that. But yeah, you could read an affirmative that is just like, seniors need more money, so we should give more money to them. Yeah.
Give billionaires more money to incentivize them to give more money away.
Yeah, great example. So let's say seniors, doctors, billionaires. I was just thinking about this last night. Like, there's a lot of evidence out there that says that rich people having money is good because they put it back into the economy. They just like, when rich people have money, instead of just like spending it on food or something like that, like they invest in stocks and other things that are necessary for economic growth. So yeah, you could read an affirmative that just like reads a bunch of right-wing evidence that says that billionaires having more money is a good thing. There's other hands, just like other like groups that you can imagine, just like getting basic income. Other examples? Yeah. Yeah, every college student. You could just like say that like college education is good. We should encourage more people to go to college. So give every college student just like $1,000 a month. So college students. Yeah. So these are all just like egregious examples of affirmatives that would be allowed if we didn't have this fiscal redistribution part of the resolution. Yeah, and there's really no limit to just like what category of people we could argue just deserve more money, and then they could just read the damages to why that category of people are good. Like, what if you're just like really worried about just like climate change and think that we need more just like electricians in order to resolve that? Maybe like electricians are good people who are necessary for our society, but there's no reasonable way that the negative will be prepared for that because it doesn't follow this fiscal redistribution part of the resolution. So you want to create a list. So here are all the people that could be affirmatives can be based around, and the negative would need to be prepared to respond to that. Okay. And then the third thing that you want to say, you want to make a list of 4 negative arguments that are guaranteed under your vision of the resolution. And we already sort of did this when we were talking about examples of grounds. So, states, capitals, and federals and politics spending, all examples of arguments that are 4 negative arguments that are guaranteed under your vision of the resolution. And it's easy to imagine how just like allowing affirmatives like this might just like violate the those certain categories of ground that we've identified as being important. Like there's not necessarily a capital, there's certainly a capitalism critique of giving billing notice more money, but there's not necessarily a capitalism critique of just like funding doctors a little bit more. But there should be, under our version of the resolution, there should be some sort of guaranteed link to those core arguments, which is why the fiscal redistribution part of the resolution is important. So you have your 3 lists of things. So robust affirmatives that are allowed, basic income based on means testing, a list of multiple egregious affirmatives that would be allowed if we did not have that particular part of the resolution, or follow the affirmative definition of it. And then 4 negative arguments that are guaranteed. So, say, state's counterplan, arguments about taxes being bad because redistribution is necessary, econ, VA, spending disadvantages, etc. What are the core arguments that are grounded on your interpretation of the resolution? So it's very important to be specific and to create lists that explain what ground looks like for each team under your definition of the resolution. Okay, questions about this? Or just like other things that you might encounter on this topic? Cool. Okay, so let's talk about answering topicality when you're affirmative. So, what section are we on now? Here. How to answer topicality when you are affirmative. Okay, so just like talking about topicality shells when you're negative, when you're affirmative answering topicality in the 2AC, there's a pretty specific structure that you want to follow in order to make sure that you're including every part. So the first one is we need. So you want to, this is contesting the violation level of topicality shell. So this contests the violation level of the topicality shell. So the negative has defined a word in the resolution, and the affirmative team has a chance to say that actually we do not violate this. And the way that they would do this is just like they would say that they meet. So they would define some word in the resolution and explain how they do this. So we have a card in our 2AC shell that says that progressive taxation redistributes the taxes by taxing high incomes more, which means that they meet. So here's a card, it's a piece of evidence that establishes that the affirmative actually meets the phrase fiscal redistribution in the resolution. Can we think of some, if we put our negative hats on, can we think of some objections that we would have to this we meet argument? Yeah?
Well, the course is progressive taxation and the app is proportional.
Yes, so the card says progressive taxation that redistributes wealth by taxing high incomes more. But the affirmative plan text specifically does not do that. It says implement a universal basic income based on a proportional income tax. So if we were negative, we would want to argue that this argument is not very credible on its face because progressive taxation might fall under the fiscal redistribution part of the resolution, but our affirmative is doing proportional taxation, not progressive taxation. But nonetheless, I think it's an argument that is worth making. So progressive taxation plays a role in popular distribution. The highest incomes are taxed at significantly higher rates and have shown in the back influence of structural inequality. Yada, yada, yada. Okay. So the first part of responding to topicality on the affirmative is a we meet that contests the violation level of topicality shell. actually, we meet your violation. Okay, the second part of every affirmative answer to topicality is a counter interpretation. Okay. So if they define a word, so this is an alternative definition to negative's definition of a phrase in the resolution. And the thing that I want to drive home about counter interpretations is that if the negative defines a word in the resolution, you always, and you're affirmative, you always need to counter define the same phrase that the negative is defining. So the negative in this case has defined redistribution, and in this case the affirmative is counter defining fiscal redistribution. So they're counter defining redistribution. So you always need another definition of any word that the negative has defined. Yeah, so ideally, this means that like when you're preparing for topicality debates as the affirmative, you want to have just like a very broad definition of every word in the resolution that is applicable to your interpretation. So ideally, you want a very broad definition of every word in the resolution that is relevant to your affirmative. So if I were debating this resolution, resolution is up here, I would want to have a very broad definition of certainly fiscal redistribution, because I could imagine some topicality violations being based on that. I would also want a broad definition of words like increase and substantially, because people can sometimes contest that a certain affirmative is not substantial based on some arbitrary definition of what that word means. I would want a really broad definition of what a basic income is, in order to ensure that I am well prepared to respond to any negative topicality violations that contest those phrases in the resolution. So you want at a minimum, you want a broad definition of every word in the resolution that's relevant to your affirmative. So let's look at our counter interpretation. This is a broad definition that obviously the affirmative falls under. So it is any tax and transfer program that is designed to fight income inequality. So fiscal redistribution captures these direct interventions that the government makes through taxes and transfers. So anything that is taxing money and giving it to a different group of people, as long as it is taxing high-income people and giving some money to low-income people, would fall under the phrase fiscal redistribution. So first part we need, second part counter-interpretation that is counter-defined in the resolution. The third thing is standards, or reasons to refer, once again. So just like what the negative did earlier, the negative has reasons to refer a particular definition of the resolution, and the affirmative needs those same standards for themselves. So most standards will be about app innovation and predictability. So what's app innovation or affirmative innovation? So this is the idea that affirmatives need to be able to explore different parts of the literature or different parts of the topic and change their arguments over the course of the year. So app innovation, it is good if affirmatives are able to explore different parts of the literature and different parts of the topic over the course of the year. So I imagine some of you are somewhat sick of just talking about universal basic income all the time. You can imagine that like there might be some problems with just like talking about the exact same universal basic income affirmative over the course of an entire season of debates. App innovation is making basically that argument. That for affirmative teams to have the best chance to win the debate, they need to be able to say different things that over the course of the year that sort of keep the negative on their toes in order to respond to it. It's not totally unlimited, so it doesn't totally violate this argument about limits that we made earlier, because it is bounded by the resolution. But in general, a broader definition of the resolution is better because it allows affirmatives to say more things and thus overcome some of the advantages that the negative has in responding to it. And then the second one is usually just predictability. So you'll notice that predictability is both a negative standard and an affirmative standard in this case. And that's because certain topicality definition or violations might be less predictable than others. And affirmative teams should generally have a predictable definition that they're responding to. So let's go back and look at our counter interpretation. And we'll see that this is a definition from somebody who is working in the context of economic inequality literature. And they have a very clear definition of fiscal redistribution with clear intent to define that explains what these policies look like. So yeah, and you see that your affirmative answers make these arguments for you. So our interpretation uses the generally accepted meaning of fiscal redistribution among economists. So we have economists who are defining what this phrase means, and we have a reason why it is reflective of the literature on economic inequality. And then second is limits. This is sort of that argument that I was making earlier about path innovation. It's not an explosion of limits. We still have just economic policies that have a specific mechanism designed to reduce inequality. But there's comparatively more flexibility under this interpretation of the resolution than the negative's more restricted definition, which is purely about UBI, or like the transfer of wealth from low-income households to high-income households. And then the last argument that we have here is reasonability, which I'll talk about later. So, predictability we talked about earlier. And then the last thing that you want to do when you're affirmative is contest the voters. So, contest the voters. And the ways that you do this, so our frame for debate was competing interpretations before. The alternative affirmative frame for debate when you're debating topicality is reasonability. Every 2AC that you give to topicality, you want to be saying reasonability and arguing that that is how topicality debates should be evaluated. So reasonability argues that if the affirmative definition is reasonably close to the negatives, then that should be enough to not vote on topicality. So the way that I like to think about reasonability is that it is an impact calculus argument. It is an argument on its own. So you all talked about impact calculus. It's that there are different ways of just like thinking about just like impacts that are in the real world when we're talking about disadvantages. There's magnitude, time frame, and probability. There are different ways of framing like which impacts that we think are most important. And reasonability is sort of like an impact calculus argument for topicality, because it argues that if an affirmative is reasonably close to the negatives definition, that should be enough to not vote on topicality. So it's a way of, it's not an argument on its own, but it's rather a way of framing the topicality debate. So if you were an affirmative team and you're responding to topicality and you were devising a strategy against a particular topicality violation, you can not only say reasonability. You can't just make an abstract appeal to the judge that's like, look, this affirmative is reasonably topical. But what you could do is argue that maybe the offense that the negative is generating is just not that big of a deal. So like maybe there's like one more affirmative that you would have to debate under our broader affirmative definition of the resolution. Competing interpretations would say that if the negative proves that there is one more affirmative that the negative would be required to debate, and they have proven that limits are a good thing, then the negative should win the debate because a more limited topic is better, and they've won that one more affirmative will be included, and that is a bad thing. Reasonability would counter that sort of way of thinking about topicality, and argue that if these definitions are reasonably close to one another, then that should be enough for the affirmative to win the debate. So you still need to prove that your interpretation of the resolution is reasonable. You need to prove that it follows like the core mandate of fiscal redistribution. You need to prove that there is sufficient ground for both sides to say it's not just like a totally unlimited version of the topic. But it sort of counters this like 1% risk way of thinking about competing interpretations, which argues that just like any direction of negative offense is enough to vote negative. Instead, reasonability argues that if the definitions are reasonably close to one another, then that should not be enough for the affirmative to lose the debate. And it's pretty intuitive to think about just like why reasonability is important. So you'll often hear this as framed in terms of competing interpretations causing a race to the margin. So competing interpretations cause a race to the margins. That is bad for research and grades. So, imagine if everybody just like agreed that competing interpretations was true, and that if the negative proves that one way in which their definition of resolution is better, then they win the debate. That would create an incentive for teams to come up with topicality violations that are just slightly more limiting than the affirmative's interpretation of resolution. And as long as they were technical debaters who are capable of winning topicality debates on the flow, then that would be enough for them to win the debate. So maybe there's one fewer case that's involved. Maybe the negative has one more piece of ground that they could say against it. And if we're using competing interpretations to think about topicality, that would be enough for them to win the debate. And reasonability counters that by arguing that if the definitions are reasonably close to one another, then they should be debated. Then that should be enough for the affirmative to win.